The tower controller at Bagram Airfield had seen 3 rotations in Afghanistan, enough to recognize the sound of an aircraft in trouble before it appeared on radar. What he heard that January morning didn't match any emergency profile in the manual. The radio crackled with a transmission so distorted by static and wind interference that only fragments came through. Bagram Tower, Hog 73, hydraulics, gear, negative response. The controller leaned forward, adjusting frequencies, trying to clear the interference. Outside, the sky stretched cloudless and bitterly cold, the kind of crystalline blue that made everything visible for miles. Other pilots in the ready room stopped mid-conversation. Someone turned down the television. The radio transmission came again, clearer this time but carrying an edge that made experienced aviators exchange glances. It was a woman's voice, controlled but tight. Bagram Hog 73 declaring emergency. Primary and secondary hydraulics offline. Manual gear extension negative. Flight controls degraded. The controller's hand moved across his console, alerting crash response teams, but his eyes stayed fixed on the northern approach corridor. An A-10 Thunderbolt limped into view, its profile unmistakable even at distance, the twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, the straight wings designed for low-altitude punishment. Except this aircraft wasn't flying right. It moved through the air with a stiffness that suggested something fundamentally wrong with its control surfaces. In the cockpit, Captain Alina Vance ran through her emergency checklist for the 4th time, already knowing the results. The stick felt wrong in her hand, responding with a mechanical resistance that shouldn't exist. Her breath fogged slightly in the cramped space despite the heater running full blast. The canopy frost had started forming 20 minutes ago, unusual for the altitude and conditions. She'd been supporting a ground convoy near the Pakistani border when the first hydraulic warning light illuminated. Standard procedure then, declare the emergency, head for base. But the second system failure changed everything. And the gear, that was the problem occupying her full attention now. She tried the emergency extension 3 times. The handle pulled correctly, the mechanical override engaged, but the indicators showed nothing. No green lights, no red lights. Just blank, as if the entire landing gear system had ceased to exist. Below her, the Hindu Kush mountains gave way to the flatter terrain surrounding Bagram. She could see the runway now, a dark line bisecting the compound. Emergency vehicles were already positioning themselves, tiny red dots forming a pattern she'd seen during training but never in actual operation. The tower called again, asking for her fuel state, her intentions. Alina checked her gauges, did the mental calculation. Enough fuel for one approach, maybe a second if she pushed it. But landing an A-10 without confirmed gear position wasn't a maybe proposition. It was controlled crash or ejection. The choice between destroying a $50 million aircraft or trusting something she couldn't verify. Her left hand stayed steady on the throttle. Her right made minute corrections to the stick. And in the tower, controllers watched an aircraft approach that shouldn't be flying at all. The senior controller grabbed the hotline to operations, his voice carrying across the tower cab. "Get me Colonel Martins, now." He didn't elaborate because he didn't need to. Everyone monitoring the situation understood the implications. An A-10 with frozen gear making an approach in sub-zero temperatures with degraded flight controls meant they were potentially watching someone's last minutes. The operation officer's voice came through the speaker, background noise suggesting he'd been pulled from a briefing. "Tower Martins, what's the status?" The controller kept his eyes on the approaching aircraft, now visible without binoculars, close enough to see the weapons pylons empty after a combat sortie. "Sir, Hog 73 inbound emergency. Both hydraulic systems offline. Gear status unknown. Pilot reports manual extension failed. She's got maybe 40 minutes fuel remaining." Silence on the line, the kind that meant someone was calculating options and not liking the mathematics. Then Martin spoke, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions. "Who's flying 7-3? The controller checked his log, though he already knew. "Captain Vance, sir." Another pause. "Alina Vance, the single mom everyone said couldn't handle the deployment tempo. The controller didn't respond to that, didn't need to engage with the politics. His job was aircraft safety, not reputation management, but he'd heard the talk. Vance had been flying combat sorties for 6 months, maintaining the same operational tempo as pilots 10 years younger, despite having 2 kids waiting stateside with her parents. Some admired it, others questioned her focus. Right now, none of that mattered. Alina began her descent, calling altitudes to the tower without prompting. Her voice remained steady, professional, the training overriding whatever fear operated beneath. She'd flown A-10s for 8 years, accumulated 1,200 hours in type, deployed twice. She knew this aircraft better than most people knew their cars. The Warthog wasn't elegant or fast, but it was survivable. Redundant systems, titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit, engines mounted where ground fire couldn't hit both simultaneously. It was built to absorb punishment and keep flying. But frozen landing gear was outside the design parameters. The Air Force had tested A-10s in extreme cold, knew the limits of hydraulic fluid and mechanical systems in sub-zero operations. What Alina was experiencing suggested something beyond standard cold weather performance degradation. As she dropped through 5,000 feet, beginning her approach pattern, she noticed ice forming on the canopy exterior, unusual given her airspeed and altitude. The temperature gauge showed normal readings, but something in the environmental system wasn't matching reality. She reported it to the tower, adding another variable to an already complex equation. In the pattern, another A-10 held at altitude, pilot monitoring the approach, ready to provide visual confirmation of gear status. Hog 73, Hog 25 has you in sight, approaching for underside visual inspection. Alina acknowledged, keeping her aircraft steady as the second A-10 maneuvered below and behind her, close enough for the pilot to observe her gear wells. The voice that came back belonged to Major Carlos Reyes, a pilot who'd logged more combat hours than most of the squadron combined. His transmission carried none of the usual radio brevity. 7325, your main gear. I can't confirm position. There's ice buildup obscuring the wells. Heavy ice shouldn't be possible at this altitude and temperature. He paused, repositioning for another look. Nose gear same condition. I'm seeing frost patterns consistent with extreme cold exposure, but external temp here is -15°C, not cold enough for this formation. Alina processed the information, her mind running through explanations. The aircraft had been operating at higher altitude earlier, supporting the convoy through mountain passes where temperatures dropped significantly lower. But she'd been back at lower altitude for 30 minutes. Ice should have sublimated or blown off. Unless the gear mechanisms themselves were cold enough to keep generating frost, which meant the metal had reached temperatures far below ambient, which wasn't physically possible unless something was wrong with thermal distribution throughout the airframe. The tower broke in, the controller's voice carrying urgency masked by professional calm. Hog 7372 is launching now to provide chase support. Colonel Martins is in the tower. He's authorizing a low approach for tower visual confirmation before you commit to landing. Alina acknowledged, adjusting her pattern. A low approach meant flying down the runway at minimum altitude without touching down, allowing ground observers to see the gear situation directly. It bought time, used fuel, but provided information. And information was the only currency that mattered in emergencies. She rolled out on final approach, the runway centerline extending ahead like a promise of safety she couldn't yet trust. The A-10 responded to her inputs with mechanical precision, the degraded hydraulics still providing enough authority for controlled flight. Just not enough authority for what came after flight ended. Major Reyes held position off her left wing, his aircraft painted in identical desert camouflage, both of them wearing the same combat scars from months of operations. They'd flown together dozens of times, covered each other through valleys where the terrain rose higher than their altitude, where enemy fire came from positions impossible to spot until tracers revealed locations. But this was different. This was physics and engineering, problems that couldn't be solved with tactical flying or weapons employment. The airfield rushed beneath her, the low approach speed making everything seem too slow and too fast simultaneously. Alina held altitude precisely, 50 feet above the runway, close enough to see maintenance crews gathered near the tower, close enough to see emergency vehicles tracking her passage. The radio crackled with multiple transmissions, people reporting what they observed, what they couldn't confirm. Colonel Martin's voice cut through the chatter, direct and clear. Captain Vance, tower visual confirms what 2-5 reported. Heavy ice formation on all gear assemblies. Your gear appears to be extended, but we cannot confirm locked position. The ice is too thick to see mechanical indicators. Alina pulled up at the far end of the runway, beginning another circuit. Her fuel gauge showed 30 minutes remaining, maybe less accounting for the approach power requirements. The mathematics of her situation crystallized into stark clarity. She had enough fuel for one more approach, one decision, one chance to get this right. The emergency manual covered landing with questionable gear, covered ditching, covered ejection parameters. What it didn't cover was gear frozen in unknown position by unexplained ice formation. She could feel the cold now, not from outside but from within the aircraft itself, as if the metal surrounding her had become a refrigeration unit pulling heat from the air. The defroster ran continuously but couldn't keep up with the frost forming on the canopy interior. This wasn't normal. This wasn't covered in any training scenario. And yet here she was, flying an aircraft that wanted to kill her in a way the enemy never managed. The tower called with fuel reminders, gentle prods toward decision time. Major Reyes stayed on her wing, silent support, ready to observe whatever came next. On the ground, crash crews waited with foam and extraction equipment. In the ready room, pilots who'd flown with her watched monitors, their earlier conversations about her deployment tempo forgotten in the immediacy of shared danger. And in the tower, Colonel Martin stood with his arms crossed, watching an aircraft approach that represented more than just one pilot's emergency. It represented the question every commander faced eventually. Who do you trust when the manual offers no answers? Alina made her decision with the clarity that came from eliminating impossible options. She couldn't eject overpopulated terrain with an uncontrolled aircraft. She couldn't ditch in the snow beyond the airfield perimeter, not with the survival rates those conditions suggested. Which left landing, trusting the gear she couldn't confirm, accepting the risk because the alternatives offered no better odds. She called the tower, her voice carrying the same professional tone she'd maintained throughout. Bagram Tower, Hog 7-3 committing to landing, declaring single approach with questionable gear position. Request all emergency equipment standing by. The controller acknowledged immediately, his response carrying the understated support that military professionals offered each other in crisis. 7-3 tower copies. Winds light and variable, altimeter 299er2, runway clear. All emergency equipment positioned and ready. You're cleared to land. The words carried finality. Once she committed to the approach, once she descended below safe ejection altitude, the only way out was through. Alina configured the aircraft for landing, throttles coming back, airspeed bleeding off. The A-10 settled into its approach profile, nose slightly high, the attitude that would put the main gear on first if they worked correctly, that would scrape titanium belly armor if they didn't. Major Reyes called from his chase position. 7-3, 2-5 staying with you through touchdown. It wasn't necessary. It violated standard procedures. But it was the kind of thing pilots did for each other when words couldn't express what needed to be said. The runway expanded beneath her, the threshold markings passing under the nose. Alina held her approach speed precisely, the training overriding instinct that wanted to go faster, slower, anywhere but committed to this narrow corridor of descending altitude. The stick felt heavy in her hand, the degraded hydraulics requiring more force than normal muscle work that reminded her this was a machine, metal and fluid and engineering, not magic or luck. At 50 feet, she made the last power adjustment. At 20 feet, she began the flare, pulling the nose up slightly, bleeding off the last of her airspeed. The ground rushed up, the numbers counting down in her peripheral vision. And then contact. The main gear touched runway concrete with a solid thump that transmitted through the entire airframe, that told Alina in one instantaneous moment that they'd locked, that they'd held, that the ice hadn't prevented the gear from doing its job. But the celebration lasted only a heartbeat before the nose gear came down. The front wheel assembly hit the runway and immediately began transmitting vibrations through the airframe that shouldn't exist. Something was wrong with the nose gear, something the ice had hidden, something that turned a successful main gear touchdown into a new emergency. The aircraft began pulling left, the asymmetric friction of damaged or locked nose wheel fighting her rudder inputs. Alina's feet worked the pedals, right rudder pressure trying to keep the centerline, trying to maintain control through the most dangerous phase of flight. The tower saw it immediately, the A-10 tracking off centerline despite Alina's corrections. Colonel Martins grabbed the microphone himself, his command voice cutting through. Hog 7-3, you're drifting left. Maintain centerline control. But Alina was already fighting for exactly that, the rudder pedals at maximum deflection, her legs burning with the effort of keeping pressure against the damaged nose gear's tendency to pull left. The aircraft decelerated through 80 knots, still moving fast enough that any directional deviation could turn into a ground loop, could collapse the gear, could transform a survivable landing into wreckage. The runway's edge approached with mathematical inevitability, the margin for error shrinking with each second. Behind her, Major Reyes transmitted continuously, calling her drift, her deceleration, providing the external reference she couldn't spare attention to check. His voice stayed calm but urgent, the combination that communicated seriousness without inducing panic. At 60 knots, Alina made a decision that would later be analyzed in safety briefings. She cut the left engine, using asymmetric thrust to counteract the nose gear's leftward pull. The technique was dangerous, outside standard procedures, but it worked. The A-10 straightened on centerline, tracking true now despite the damaged wheel. The right engine wound down slowly, Alina controlling the deceleration with brake pressure and aerodynamic drag, letting the aircraft slow itself rather than forcing it with aggressive braking that might overstress the questionable gear. At 20 knots, the nose gear assembly finally failed. The locked or damaged wheel dug into the runway surface, the strut absorbed stress beyond its design limits, and with a sound like artillery, the nose of the aircraft dropped as the gear collapsed. But 20 knots was walking speed. The A-10's titanium bathtub hit the runway, throwing sparks and noise but protecting everything it was designed to protect. Alina activated the emergency shutdown sequences, her hands moving through memorized patterns as the aircraft scraped to a halt, friction and physics doing what her controls no longer could. The canopy stayed intact. The engine spooled down without fire, and Alina sat in a cockpit suddenly silent except for the sound of emergency vehicles approaching at speed. She'd been flying for 90 minutes since declaring the emergency. It felt like 9 minutes. It felt like 9 hours. The fire suppression teams arrived first, foam already spraying before the truck stopped, covering the aircraft in white chemical blanket as insurance against fuel leaks and hot metal. Alina began unstrapping, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline had nowhere to go. The canopy opened manually, rescue personnel appearing at her shoulder before she could climb out unassisted. They helped her down to the runway, their movements efficient but gentle, understanding that physical injury wasn't the only consideration after an emergency like this. Major Reyes landed normally behind her, taxiing clear before shutting down and jogging across the tarmac toward the crash site. Alina stood on the runway, foam covering her boots, watching maintenance crews inspect her aircraft. From this angle, the damage looked worse. The collapsed nose gear had torn open panels, scraped away paint and metal, exposed internal structure never meant to see daylight. But the aircraft was intact. The wings were undamaged. The engines could be removed and reused. They'd recover this bird, repair it, return it to service. That's what the A-10 was built for, survivability. Colonel Martins arrived in a pickup truck that skidded to a halt near the emergency vehicles. He climbed out without his usual measured pace, covering ground quickly toward Alina. His expression was unreadable, the commander face that revealed nothing until he decided to reveal everything. He stopped 3 feet away, studying her as if looking for injuries that weren't physical. "Captain Vance. Hell of a job bringing that bird home." Alina nodded, not trusting her voice yet. Martins continued, his tone shifting from commander to fellow pilot. "I want you in medical right now, full evaluation. Then I want you in debrief. What happened to your aircraft is outside normal operations parameters, and we need to understand it before someone else experiences the same thing." He paused, glancing at the damaged A-10. "But first, I want you to know something. When we heard your initial emergency call, when we realized what you were dealing with, there were people who questioned whether you had the experience to handle it, whether the deployment tempo had caught up with you, whether being a single mom on back-to-back rotations had degraded your capabilities." He let that hang in the air between them, the unspoken names and conversations that happened in rooms where Alina wasn't present. Then his expression hardened into something Alina had rarely seen from senior officers: respect without qualification. "Those people can explain themselves to me personally, because what you just did showed better judgment and better airmanship than most pilots will demonstrate in entire careers. You made correct decisions at every decision point, executed a landing that shouldn't have been survivable, and saved a multi-million-dollar asset while keeping yourself alive. That's the job. That's exactly the job." Alina felt something unlock in her chest, emotion she'd been suppressing throughout the emergency, finding space to exist. She nodded again, managed a response that sounded steadier than she felt. "Thank you, sir. But I'd like to know what went wrong with my aircraft before I take credit for handling it. Because the ice formation, the gear freezing, none of that matches anything I've been trained for." Martins turned toward the damaged A-10, his eyes tracking over the visible frost still clinging to the gear assemblies despite the ambient temperature. "Agreed. Maintenance is already pulling data recorders. We'll have investigators here from Kandahar before dark. Whatever happened to your bird, we're going to understand it completely before any other A-10 in theater takes off." Major Reyes arrived, slightly winded from his jog across the tarmac, his helmet still under his arm. Reyes looked at Alina with the expression pilots shared after watching each other survive. Not congratulations, not relief, but acknowledgement. "That was the best emergency flying I've seen, and I've seen plenty. When you cut that left engine, I thought you were insane. Then I thought you were brilliant." Alina allowed herself a small smile, the first since the hydraulic warning light had illuminated 90 minutes earlier. "I was a little bit of both. Mostly I was out of better options." Martins gestured toward the waiting vehicles. "Medical first, then debrief. Reyes, you're joining us. I want your observations documented while they're fresh." As they walked toward the pickup, Alina glanced back at her aircraft one more time. The A-10 sat at an awkward angle on its collapsed nose, covered in foam, surrounded by equipment and personnel, looking every bit like the wounded bird it was. But it had brought her home. Through hydraulic failure and frozen gear and unexplained ice formation, through landing gear collapse and emergency shutdown, it had done what it was designed to do: protect the pilot, complete the mission, survive. The medical evaluation took 20 minutes, mostly paperwork and routine checks that confirmed what Alina already knew. She was uninjured physically. The flight surgeon signed her off with recommendations for stress monitoring and mandatory rest before returning to flight status. Standard post-emergency protocol. Nothing surprising. Nothing that suggested the Air Force doubted her fitness to continue flying. The debrief was different. Held in a secure conference room with Colonel Martins, Major Reyes, the maintenance officer, and a captain from safety investigating the incident, it went beyond routine data collection. They wanted timeline, decision trees, system responses, everything Alina could remember about the flight from first warning light to landing. She walked them through it systematically, pilot precision applied to memory reconstruction. The initial hydraulic failure near the Pakistani border. The second system going offline. The manual gear extension attempts. The radio calls. The approach decisions. The landing and subsequent gear collapse. They listened without interruption, taking notes, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested her narrative aligned with other data they'd already collected. When she finished, the maintenance officer leaned forward, his expression troubled. "Captain, we pulled the preliminary data from your aircraft's recorders. What you experienced wasn't mechanical failure in the traditional sense. Your hydraulic systems didn't fail. They froze. From the inside, the fluid crystallized in the lines." He paused, letting that impossibility sink in. "The operating temperature of your hydraulic fluid is designed to remain liquid at -40 Celsius. Your aircraft was never an environment cold enough to cause crystallization. But the recorders show internal temperatures in some systems dropping to -60, -70 Celsius, temperatures that shouldn't be possible in flight." Elena absorbed this information, her mind working through implications. So something was cooling my aircraft beyond environmental exposure, something internal. The maintenance officer nodded slowly. "That's what the data suggests, but we don't know what. There's no refrigeration system on an A-10, no way for the airframe to generate cold. Environmental control systems regulate temperature up, not down. What you experienced violates basic thermodynamics." Silence settled over the room, the kind of silence that accompanied problems without obvious solutions. Then Major Reyes spoke, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone proposing something that sounded ridiculous. "What if it wasn't the aircraft? What if it was external, something she flew through or was exposed to during the mission?" The safety captain pulled up a map on the conference room screen, showing Elena's flight path that morning. "Captain Vance, you were supporting a convoy through the Khyber Pass region. Can you remember anything unusual about the mission? Anything that might have exposed your aircraft to extreme cold?" Elena studied the map, retracing her morning mentally. The convoy escort had been routine, overwatch through mountain valleys, ready for ground support if needed. The weather had been clear, visibility unlimited. Temperature cold but normal for altitude and season. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested exposure to extreme conditions. Except the memory surfaced slowly, detail that hadn't seemed important during the emergency but now gained significance. There was a valley, about 40 minutes before the first hydraulic warning. The convoy route went through a narrow defile where the terrain rose above my altitude. I descended to maintain visual contact. She closed her eyes, bringing the memory into sharper focus. The air in that valley felt different. That's not scientific, I know, but the aircraft flew differently, more responsive at first than sluggish. I attributed it to turbulence from terrain effects, but the temperature gauge dropped 15 degrees in 30 seconds, then recovered when I climbed back out. Colonel Martins exchanged glances with the safety captain. "Did you report the temperature anomaly?" Elena shook her head. "No, sir." It was brief and the gauge recovered. I assumed instrument error or temporary environmental effect. The convoy needed coverage and I didn't have time to troubleshoot minor anomalies. The maintenance officer made notes, his expression suggesting this information meant something. "Captain, instrument errors don't usually self-correct perfectly. If your temperature sensor malfunctioned, it would be erratic or stay wrong. A sharp drop followed by normal recovery suggests actual environmental change, which means you flew through something cold enough to drop your external temperature 15 degrees in half a minute." Reyes pulled up more detailed terrain maps, zooming into the region Elena described. "This valley here, Khyber Pass approaches. High terrain both sides, narrow corridor. There have been reports from other flights about unusual conditions in this area, but nothing substantive. Pilots feeling cold spots, instruments showing brief anomalies. Everyone assumed terrain effects or equipment issues." The safety captain stood, moving to the screen to study the terrain more closely. "We need to investigate this valley specifically. If there's environmental condition causing extreme cold exposure, other aircraft are at risk." He turned to Elena. Captain, would you recognize this valley if you saw it again? Could you guide us to the exact location? Alina nodded without hesitation. Yes, sir. I logged the coordinates when I descended, standard procedure for terrain navigation. They're in my mission data. Martin stood as well, the debrief shifting from information gathering to operational planning. Safety team will investigate the valley. Until we understand what happened, all A-10 operations in that region are suspended. Captain Vance, you're grounded pending medical clearance and safety review completion. Not punitive, just procedural. Alina expected this, understood it, still felt the frustration of being taken off flight status. But Martin's wasn't finished. I'm also putting you in for a commendation medal for your handling of this emergency. What you did today was exceptional airmanship under impossible conditions. The medal is recognition, but more importantly, your actions are going into immediate training curriculum. Other pilots need to know how you diagnosed the problem, how you made decisions, how you executed that landing. You turned an aircraft loss into a lesson, and that matters. The room emptied gradually, people moving toward their next tasks. The debrief concluded. Alina remained seated, the adrenaline finally draining completely, leaving exhaustion in its wake. 24 hours earlier, she'd been dealing with the usual deployment challenges. Missing her kids' video calls because of mission scheduling, fighting exhaustion from back-to-back sorties, hearing whispers about single mothers and combat effectiveness, about whether her presence in theater was fair to her children, whether she could maintain the operational tempo that military aviation demanded. Now she was grounded, pending investigation, her aircraft destroyed in an emergency that shouldn't have been survivable. And somehow, that felt like validation, not the medal or the commendation. Not even Colonel Martin's words about exceptional airmanship. The validation came from the simple fact that she'd been tested by circumstances beyond her control, beyond anyone's training or preparation, and she'd performed. The doubters hadn't been in that cockpit. They hadn't felt the stick go stiff, hadn't watched ice form on instruments, hadn't made the calculation between ejection and landing with questionable gear. They'd been safe on the ground, questioning her dedication while she flew missions. And in the moment that counted, their questions had proven irrelevant. 2 days passed before the investigation team reported back from the valley Alina had flown through. 2 days of mandatory rest that felt like punishment, of watching other pilots take missions while she remained grounded, of video calls with her kids where she couldn't explain why she wasn't flying. The operations officer found her in the ready room on the 3rd morning, watching weather updates that didn't apply to her current status. Captain Vance, Colonel wants you in the briefing room. Investigation team's back. Alina followed him through corridors that felt more familiar than any building stateside, the deployment base that had been home for 6 months. The briefing room held more people than expected. Martin's at the front, the safety captain beside him, maintenance officers, intelligence personnel, and several pilots including Major Reyes. Whatever they'd found in that valley, it was significant enough to brief the squadron. Martin's waited for everyone to settle before beginning, his expression carrying the weight of information that changed operational parameters. 3 days ago, Captain Vance experienced a catastrophic emergency caused by extreme cold exposure that shouldn't have been physically possible. Yesterday, our investigation team located the source. He gestured to the safety captain, who pulled up satellite imagery on the screen. The valley appeared as Alina remembered it, narrow and deep, terrain rising steeply on both sides. But the imagery showed something else, something that hadn't been visible from the cockpit. A cave system, large openings in the valley walls at approximately the altitude Alina had been flying. The safety captain zoomed the image, enhancing details. These caves were unknown to intelligence prior to Captain Vance's flight. They're not visible from higher altitude, and ground forces don't patrol this deep into the terrain. What makes them significant isn't the caves themselves, it's what's stored inside them. More images appeared, these taken by ground team with proper equipment and authorization. Inside the caves, stacked systematically, were containers. Large metal cylinders with Russian markings, insulated transport vessels designed for extreme temperature control. The investigation team found approximately 40 containers, most still sealed. The ones they could safely inspect contained liquid nitrogen, medical-grade cryogenic materials, and in 3 cases, what appeared to be chemical weapons components requiring ultra-cold storage. The room's atmosphere changed immediately, relaxed attention transforming into alert focus. Martins took over the briefing. The containers are part of an abandoned Soviet-era weapons cache, left behind during the Soviet-Afghan War and forgotten. Based on the containment integrity and temperature logs, several containers failed recently, venting cryogenic materials directly into the valley. Captain Vance flew through a cloud of nitrogen vapor and ultra-cold air mixture that shouldn't exist naturally. That's what crystallized her hydraulic fluid, what froze her landing gear, what caused the ice formation. Alina processed this information, understanding dawning. She hadn't experienced equipment failure. She'd flown through a weapons cache accident, an environmental hazard that existed because conflicts decades old still littered Afghanistan with dangers. The safety captain continued, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering bad news. This valley is now designated contaminated airspace. No flight operations until the cache is secured and removed. Intel estimates 3 weeks minimum for recovery operations. Major Reyes raised his hand, the gesture carrying irony in a room of military officers. So Captain Vance survived flying through what amounts to a chemical weapon release, the safety captain nodded. Effectively, yes, though unintentional. The container failures were due to age and temperature cycling, not enemy action. But the effect was the same, extreme cold exposure sufficient to compromise aircraft systems. Martin stepped forward again, his command presence filling the room. Which brings me to the operational changes. First, all Mountain Valley operations now require pre-flight intelligence review for known weapons caches. Second, emergency procedures are being updated to include extreme cold exposure scenarios. Third, Captain Vance's emergency handling is going into immediate training curriculum because she demonstrated decision-making that saved her life when manuals offered no guidance. He paused, looking directly at Alina. And fourth, Captain Vance is being cleared to return to flight status immediately. Medical evaluation shows no lasting effects. Safety review confirms her actions were correct at every decision point, and this squadron needs experienced pilots who can handle the unexpected. Alina felt relief wash through her, the 3-day grounding lifted, status restored. But Martin's wasn't finished. There's something else. When word of this incident reached higher command, when they understood what Captain Vance survived, some interesting conversations happened. Conversations about combat effectiveness, about deployment tempo, about single parents in combat zones. The room went quiet, everyone understanding the subtext. These conversations had been happening about Alina specifically, questions about her fitness and focus whispered in command posts and operations centers. Martins continued, his voice carrying an edge that suggested personal involvement in those conversations. Those conversations are now concluded. Captain Vance has demonstrated under actual emergency conditions that she possesses the judgment, skill, and composure required for combat aviation at the highest level. Any future questions about her effectiveness can be addressed to me personally, and I will be happy to review her performance record with anyone who needs clarity. It was as close to public defense as a colonel could offer a captain, a statement that carried weight throughout the command structure. Alina felt emotion tighten her throat, recognition that mattered more than medals. Martins dismissed the briefing, people flowing toward their duties. Alina remained behind, approaching the colonel as the room emptied. "Sir, thank you for the defense for the public statement." Martins waved it off, but not dismissively. "I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because those conversations were undermining your effectiveness and the squadron's cohesion. Your emergency performance ended the debate. You proved what needed proving, and now everyone can focus on flying missions instead of questioning your presence." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "That said, I understand the challenges you're facing. Two kids stateside, 6-month deployment missing important moments in their lives. That's real and it costs you. Alina nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement. It does cost, sir, every day, but they have good support. My parents are handling things and I knew the commitment when I signed up. This is the job. Martin smiled, the expression carrying recognition of truth spoken plainly. It is the job, and you're doing it better than most. Now get back on the flight schedule. The operations officer has missions waiting and we're short pilots with your experience level. Alina left the briefing room. The 3-day pause between emergency and return to flight status concluded. The ready room held familiar faces, pilots who'd watched her emergency landing, who'd heard the debrief details, who understood what she'd survived. Their greetings carried a different quality now, respect that came from shared profession recognizing excellence. Major Reyes caught her before she could check the flight schedule. Vance, glad you're back. I'm leading a mission tomorrow, 4 ships supporting ground ops near Kandahar. Want your slot back? Alina checked the mission board, confirming the details. Standard close air support, the mission profile she'd flown hundreds of times. Routine work that sustained operations, that kept ground forces safe, that justified the deployment and the time away from her kids. I'm in. Briefing time. Reyes gave her the details, then added something that carried more weight than mission specifics. The emergency, the valley, the investigation, all of that overshadowed something important. You've been flying combat sorties for 6 months. That makes you the second most experienced hog driver in this squadron. People forget that because they're too busy wondering about your kids. Lena appreciated the observation, the reminder that her record spoke clearly to anyone actually reading it. 6 months of combat operations, successful missions, ground forces supported, emergencies handled correctly. The metrics that mattered in military aviation, the numbers that defined effectiveness regardless of personal circumstances. Thanks for noticing. Most people don't look past the single parent label. Reyes shrugged, the gesture carrying the pragmatism of experienced pilots. Most people are idiots. I care about who I'm flying with, whether they'll hold formation, whether they'll make correct calls under pressure. You proved all that 3 days ago. Everything else is noise. The next morning, Alina walked to her aircraft in pre-dawn darkness, the familiar ritual of pre-flight inspection grounding her in routine. A different A-10, not her damaged bird still sitting in the maintenance hangar awaiting repair. This aircraft showed its own combat history, panel repairs and paint touch-ups marking where ground fire had found target, where maintenance had restored functionality. She ran her hands over the leading edge, checking control surfaces, verifying what maintenance had already verified. The pre-flight inspection was partly technical requirement, partly meditation, the pilot's conversation with machine before asking it to carry her into hostile airspace. The crew chief approached, young airman whose job was keeping this bird flyable. Morning, Captain. She's good to go. Fresh hydraulic service after your emergency. Figured you'd appreciate the extra attention to fluid systems. Alina smiled at the consideration, the crew chief understanding that near-death experiences with hydraulic failure created lasting attention to specific systems. Thanks, I do appreciate it. Any other maintenance issues I should know about? The crew chief consulted his logbook. Port engine oil consumption slightly high but within limits. We're monitoring it. Everything else is green. She'll bring you home. At phrase, the simple assurance that carried more meaning than technical specifications, reminded Alina why she trusted crew chiefs absolutely. They signed their names to the maintenance, staked their professional reputation on aircraft safety. When they said an aircraft would bring you home, they meant it. The mission brief was straightforward, 4 A-10s supporting marine operations near Kandahar. Taliban forces had been active in the region, intelligence suggested possible attack on forward operating bases. The Hogs would provide overwatch, ready to respond with close air support if ground forces made contact. Standard counterinsurgency operations, the kind of mission that defined Afghanistan deployment. Major Reyes led the brief with practiced efficiency, covering weather, communications, weapons loadout, rules of engagement. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested today would differ from any other mission. But Alina had learned 3 days earlier that routine could transform into emergency without warning, that Afghanistan didn't respect mission plans. The takeoff felt like returning to familiar room after long absence. The accelerated down the runway, the twin turbofan engines providing thrust that felt adequate rather than exciting, the aircraft designed for loitering and precision rather than speed and altitude. At rotation speed, Alina pulled back gently, the nose lifting, the main gear leaving concrete, the transition from ground to air that never lost its significance no matter how many times she experienced it. The gear retracted with solid mechanical certainty, 3 green lights extinguishing as the wheels tucked into their wells. No warning lights, no hydraulic failures, just normal operation the way it was supposed to work. The four-ship formed up heading south, flying low enough to maintain visual contact with terrain, high enough to avoid small arms engagement. Afghanistan spread beneath them in browns and grays, the winter landscape showing snow on high peaks, dust everywhere else. Beautiful in its harshness, unforgiving in ways that matched the conflict being fought across its valleys and villages. The radio traffic was routine, occasional position reports, frequency checks, coordination with ground controllers who managed the airspace and connected aircraft with forces needing support. Alina settled into the rhythm of combat patrol, eyes scanning for threats, hands ready on controls, mind processing information without conscious effort. Hours of training and experience converting observation into instant recognition, the combat pilots developed instinct for danger. 2 hours into the patrol, the radio crackled with urgency that changed everything. Any hog, this is Kodiak 26. We are taking effective fire from prepared positions. Grid November Bravo 473285. Request immediate close air support. Danger close, friendlies marked with orange smoke. Major Reyes responded immediately, his voice carrying command authority. Kodiak 26, Hog 31 flight has you covered. For A-10s, full ordnance load 3 minutes out. Authenticate position with smoke. The response came through automatic weapons fire audible in the background. Hog 31, Kodiak authenticates orange smoke popping now. Enemy positions in tree line 200 meters north of smoke, dug in effective cover. We need guns, we need them now. Alina felt the shift from routine to combat, the change in air pressure and mental acuity that accompanied real engagement. Rays rolled their formation toward the grid coordinates, descending to attack altitude, spacing the 4 aircraft for successive gun runs. Hog Flight 3-1, fights on. 2, you're first in. 3 and 4, hold high cover. Standard gun pattern, watch for ground fire. Ground forces marked with orange smoke confirmed. Enemy north of smoke in tree line. Questions? No questions. The plan was clear, the threat was clear, the target was clear. Everything else was execution. Alina held her position as Major Rey's wingman rolled in ahead of her, the first A-10 diving toward the target area, the 30 GAU-8 Avenger cannon spooling up for its distinctive sound that ground forces called the BRRRT. The cannon designed to destroy tanks now bringing precision fire to enemy positions. The sound carried across the valley even at altitude, unmistakable, terrifying if you were on the receiving end. The first pulled off target, climbing and turning for another pass. Hog 3-1 hits on target. Enemy fire suppressed. 2, you're cleared hot. Major Rey's call meant Alina's turn, her opportunity to employ the weapon system she'd trained years to master. She rolled inverted, pulling the nose through to establish sight picture, the target appearing in her heads-up display exactly where intelligence said it would be. Trees, defensive positions, muzzle flashes indicating active fire despite the first gun run. The cannon sight pipper tracked onto target. Alina verified friendly positions, confirmed no orange smoke in her weapon impact area, met all engagement criteria. Then she squeezed the trigger, and the GAU-8 came alive. The cannon fired at 70 rounds per second, depleted uranium projectiles designed to penetrate armor, now shredding defensive positions that offered no protection against this level of firepower. The aircraft shuddered with recoil, the gun literally slowing the A-10's forward velocity, the pilot compensating with throttle and stick. 2 seconds of firing, 140 rounds downrange, precision application of overwhelming force. Alina pulled off target, climbing and turning, her eyes already scanning for threats, for ground fire, for anything that might endanger her or her wingmen. The radio confirmed results immediately. Hog 3-2, solid hits. Enemy fire ceased. Kodiak 2-6 confirms targets destroyed, no more contact. You guys just saved our lives. Major Reyes acknowledged, professional satisfaction in his voice. Kodiak 2-6, Hog 3-1, glad we could help. We'll maintain overhead coverage until you're clear of the area. Call if you need us. The formation reassembled at altitude, 4 A-10s orbiting the engagement area, watching for renewed enemy activity, ready to respond instantly if required. But the fight was over, the enemy positions destroyed, the ground forces saved. Mission accomplished, the simple binary outcome that justified everything else. On the flight back to Bagram, Alina's aircraft tracking slightly behind and beside Major Rey's lead position, she reflected on the difference between the emergency 3 days ago and the mission today. The emergency had been survival, systems failing, physics working against her, success measured in not dying. The mission had been purpose, systems functioning, training converting into precise application of firepower at exact moment required. Both were flying. Both demanded everything she could give. But only one was why she'd chosen this profession, why she'd left her kids for 6 months, why she accepted the questions and doubts about single mothers in combat zones. Because when Kodiak 2-6 called for help, when Marines were taking fire from entrenched positions, political considerations about her family situation became irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was bringing precision firepower to protect ground forces, and she could do that better than most pilots in theater, regardless of whether she had kids waiting stateside. That evening, Alina finally connected with her children via video call, the time difference and mission schedule finally aligning. Her daughter was 8, her son 6, both staying with Alina's parents in Virginia, both adjusted to routines that didn't include their mother. The adjustment hurt more than Alina could express, the knowledge that her kids were learning to be fine without her daily presence. "Mom, Grandpa said you had an emergency with your plane." Her daughter's voice carried excitement rather than worry, too young to understand the stakes, raised in military culture that normalized danger. Alina smiled, keeping her tone light. "I did have some problems, but everything worked out. The plane is being repaired and I'm flying again. How's school?" Her son leaned into the camera. "I got an A on my math test. Grandma put it on the refrigerator. When are you coming home?" The question never got easier, no matter how many times Alina answered it. 2 more months, buddy. Then I'll be home for a while before the next deployment. We'll do everything you want, I promise." Her daughter looked thoughtful, the expression too serious for 8 years old. "Are you safe, Mom? Really safe?" Alina considered lying, offering empty assurance that combat aviation was perfectly safe. But her kids deserved honesty calibrated to their understanding. "I'm as safe as I can be. I fly with good pilots, my plane is strong, and I'm very careful. Sometimes dangerous things happen, but I know how to handle them. That's why I trained for so long." Her daughter seemed satisfied with this answer, moving on to stories about school and friends, normal childhood details that felt both precious and distant to Alina. The call lasted 15 minutes before the kids had to go, bedtime approaching in Virginia. Alina said her goodbyes, promised to call again soon, ended the connection feeling the familiar hollow space that video calls never quite filled. Major Reyes found her in the ready room later, ostensibly checking weather updates but actually processing the emotional cost of deployment. He didn't ask about the call, didn't need to. Most deployed parents carried the same expression after connecting with their kids. "It gets easier," he said, settling into a nearby chair. "That's what everyone tells me. 3 deployments, 2 kids, and it still hurts every time." Alina appreciated the honesty, the recognition that deployment separated families regardless of rank or experience. Do you regret it, the deployments being away from them? Reyes considered the question seriously. Sometimes, when I miss birthdays or first days of school or just Tuesday dinner. But then I fly missions like today, where we save Marines who would have died without close air support, and I remember why I'm here. The guilt doesn't go away, but it gets balanced by purpose. Alina nodded, understanding the calculation he described. Purpose versus presence, the choice every military parent faced, the reason some people questioned whether she should be deployed at all. But the questioning assumed her kids would prefer a present parent over a purposeful one, assumed safety was more valuable than service. Her children were being raised by grandparents who understood military commitment, who could explain why their mother deployed repeatedly, who could help them understand the difference between absence and abandonment. And when Alina returned, she would be whole, fulfilled by work that mattered, rather than resentful of opportunities denied by other people's opinions about proper parenting. The weeks following Alina's emergency transformed into deployment routine, missions and maintenance, weather holds and combat sorties. The squadron settled into operational rhythm, the crisis of frozen hydraulics replaced by standard challenges of sustained combat operations. But something had shifted in how people regarded Alina, subtle changes in tone and attention that marked altered perception. Pilots who'd barely acknowledged her before now sought her opinion on tactical decisions. Ground crews showed extra attention to her aircraft. Even Colonel Martins included her in planning sessions normally restricted to flight leads and senior captains. The emergency had done what 6 months of successful missions hadn't, proved her competence in terms that overcame prior skepticism. She'd survived circumstances that would have justified ejection, made decisions that saved aircraft and pilot, executed landing that became immediate training curriculum. The proof was undeniable, documented, reviewed at every level. And grudgingly, the doubters stopped doubting. Major Reyes recommended her for upgrade to flight lead, the designation that carried command authority for multi-aircraft missions. The recommendation required Colonel Martin's approval, endorsement that came with surprising enthusiasm. Captain Vance has demonstrated tactical judgment and emergency handling that exceeds many flight leads currently in this squadron. Her upgrade to flight lead is approved immediately, effective with required currency training completion. The currency training was formality, demonstration flights confirming she could plan missions, lead formations, make tactical decisions under pressure. Alina completed the requirements efficiently, her performance reflecting skills developed over years rather than recent emergency. But the emergency mattered because it made people pay attention to skills they'd previously dismissed. 2 months after the emergency, Alina led her first mission as flight lead, a 2-ship formation supporting special operations forces in the mountains near the Pakistani border. Not the same valley where she'd encountered the cryogenic vapor, but close enough that mission planning included detailed intelligence review for weapons caches and environmental hazards. The mission brief reflected her leadership style, detailed without being controlling, clear about expectations without micromanaging execution. Her wingman was a young lieutenant on his first deployment, eager and competent but inexperienced in Afghanistan's unique operational environment. Alina remembered being that lieutenant, remembered veterans providing patient guidance through early missions. Now she was the experienced pilot, responsible for teaching the next generation. The mission was routine until it wasn't, the pattern that defined combat aviation. Special operations forces made contact with enemy fighters, requested close air support, needed precision fires in terrain that made weapons employment challenging. Alina coordinated with ground forces, established communication with her wingman, set up attack pattern that would bring maximum firepower while minimizing risk to friendly forces. Her lieutenant performed well, following directions, maintaining situational awareness, executing gun runs with competence that suggested good training and better instincts. But on the third pass, his aircraft took ground fire, small arms that shouldn't threaten an A-10 but occasionally found vulnerable systems. Lead 2, I've got warning lights. Oil pressure dropping on starboard engine. Recommend terminating attack and returning to base. Alina assessed immediately, checking fuel state, tactical situation, distance to base. The mission was nearly complete, ground forces no longer in contact, threat minimal. The decision was clear. 2 lead copies. Terminate attack, climb to altitude, heading 090 to Bagram. I'm on your wing. Call your fuel state. The lieutenant's response came slightly rushed but controlled. Lead, fuel shows 40 minutes, oil pressure still dropping. I'm securing starboard engine now. Standard procedure, shutting down the damaged engine before it failed catastrophically. The A-10 could fly on one engine, could make it home on one engine, but margin for error narrowed significantly. Alina moved into close formation, positioning where she could observe her wingman's aircraft, watch for smoke or fluid leaks, provide immediate warning if situation deteriorated. The flight back took 30 minutes, both aircraft maintaining altitude and speed that balanced fuel consumption against time to safe landing. The lieutenant's emergency was minor compared to Alina's frozen hydraulics experience, but it was his first emergency, his first time flying damaged aircraft in combat zone. His voice stayed professional, but Alina could hear the tension underneath. 2. How's your aircraft handling? She asked, giving him something to focus on beyond warning lights. Lead, handling feels normal. Single engine performance as expected. I'm showing stable oil pressure on port engine, all other systems green. Good signs, suggesting containable problem rather than cascading failure. Alina maintained position, watching her wingman's aircraft for any indication of worsening condition. The A-10 ahead of her showed no obvious damage, no smoke trail, no visible leaks. Just one engine shut down, the other maintaining power, bringing the wounded bird home the way the Warthog was designed to do. They landed sequentially, the lieutenant first with Alina following immediately after, both aircraft touching down safely, emergency vehicles positioned as precaution. As they taxied clear of the runway, Alina transmitted final instruction. 2. Good job handling the emergency. Shut down next to maintenance, they'll inspect the engine. Debrief in 30 minutes. The lieutenant's response carried relief mixed with pride. Lead, thanks for the coverage. Felt better having you on my wing. Alina understood the sentiment, remembered her own early emergencies, the value of experienced pilots providing calm presence during crisis. That's what flight leads did, what the position required beyond tactical skills. Leadership meant absorbing stress, providing confidence, making subordinates believe they could handle whatever came next. The debrief was straightforward, mechanical failure rather than pilot error, systems performing as designed by shutting down damaged engine before it failed completely. The lieutenant had followed procedures correctly, made appropriate decisions, demonstrated judgment that suggested he'd develop into good combat pilot. Alina told him exactly that during debrief, the positive reinforcement that mattered more than critique. You handled that well. First emergency is always hardest, but you stayed calm, followed procedures, got the aircraft home safely. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. The lieutenant nodded, accepting the praise with appropriate modesty. Thank you, ma'am. Having you there helped. Knowing you'd survived worse made me think I could handle this. Alina smiled at that, the recognition that her emergency had become squadron legend, teaching tool for newer pilots. Different emergencies require different responses, but the principle is always the same. Fly the aircraft, make correct decisions, don't panic. You did all of that today. That evening, Alina received unexpected communication from higher headquarters, a colonel from Air Combat Command she'd never met. The video call came through official channels, suggesting something beyond routine communication. The colonel appeared on screen, his expression professionally neutral. Captain Vance, I'm Colonel Richards from ACC Safety. I've been reviewing your emergency from 2 months ago. Your handling of that situation has generated significant interest at higher levels. We'd like you to participate in developing new training curriculum for extreme weather emergency procedures. Alina absorbed this, the request carrying implications beyond curriculum development. Sir, I'd be honored to contribute. What specifically are you looking for? Richards pulled up documents she couldn't see. Your emergency exposed gaps in our training for environmental hazards in combat zones. We need realistic scenarios, decision trees, procedure modifications. You survived something outside our existing training models. We want to incorporate your experience before another pilot faces similar situation without preparation. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering technical details, training objectives, timeline for curriculum development. Richards was thorough, asking questions that indicated genuine interest in learning from her experience rather than just checking boxes for safety compliance. At the end, he added something that carried more weight than training discussion. Captain Vance, your performance during that emergency has been noticed at very senior levels. People are aware of your capabilities. Opportunities may become available that wouldn't normally be offered to captains at your experience level. I'm authorized to tell you that your career trajectory is being watched by people who can influence assignments. Alina understood the implication, the suggestion that her emergency had opened doors normally closed to junior officers. I appreciate that information, sir. I'm focused on completing this deployment successfully, but I'd welcome future opportunities that challenge me appropriately. Richard smiled, the expression carrying knowledge of how military careers developed. Complete your deployment, spend time with your kids, then we'll talk about what comes next, but be ready for your next assignment to look different than you expected. The call ended, leaving Alina with new awareness of how singular events could redirect careers. She'd survived an emergency, documented the experience, contributed to training development. Standard progression for combat pilots. Except the attention from ACC Safety, the mention of senior leadership awareness, suggested her emergency had resonated beyond normal safety review processes. Someone with rank and influence had decided her performance mattered, that her experience should be leveraged more broadly, which meant her next assignment wouldn't be routine squadron duty, which meant the deployment's end would bring new challenges. The final 6 weeks of deployment compressed into intense operational tempo, the squadron flying maximum missions before rotation home. Alina led multiple sorties, each mission reinforcing her reputation as steady flight lead who made correct decisions under pressure. The younger pilots gravitated toward her, seeking advice on tactical employment and career progression. The older pilots treated her as peer, the recognition that mattered most in community where competence was currency. Colonel Martins called her into his office 2 weeks before scheduled return to the United States, the summons suggesting something beyond routine discussion. She reported in uniform, the formal context indicating official business. Martins gestured to a chair, his expression carrying satisfaction. Captain Vance, I wanted to speak with you before you rotate home. Your performance during this deployment has been exceptional. The emergency, the upgrade to flight lead, the training curriculum development, all of it has created very positive attention at higher levels. Alina nodded, suspecting where this conversation led based on her previous call with Colonel Richards. Martins continued, pulling out a folder that suggested official orders. ACC Safety wants you at Nellis Air Force Base, working with the Weapons School on curriculum development for combat aviation emergency procedures. It's a 2-year assignment, non-deployable, based in Nevada. You'll be teaching the best pilots in the Air Force while developing training that will save lives. Interested? The offer was extraordinary, exactly the kind of career opportunity that accelerated advancement, that positioned officers for leadership roles. Nellis Air Force Base, home to the Weapons School, was where the Air Force sent its best pilots for advanced tactical training. But it was also Nevada, far from Virginia where her parents and kids currently lived. 2 years non-deployable sounded positive until she considered relocating her entire family cross-country, pulling kids from established schools and support networks. Alina kept her expression neutral, processing implications. Sir, that's an honor. Can I ask about family considerations? My kids are currently with my parents in Virginia. Moving them to Nevada would require significant coordination. Martins nodded, having anticipated this concern. Family relocation support would be provided. Base housing available, excellent schools near Nellie's. Your parents welcome to relocate with you if they choose. ACC understands the family situation and wants to make this work. They specifically want you, not just any pilot who survived an emergency. Alina appreciated the directness, the acknowledgement that her family's circumstances required special consideration. When would the assignment start? Martins checked the folder. 4 months after you rotate home. Enough time to spend with your kids, handle relocation, get your family settled before you report to Nellie's. The timing is designed to work with your situation. It was thoughtful planning, the Air Force demonstrating flexibility that contradicted assumptions about institutional rigidity regarding single parents. They wanted her expertise enough to accommodate her circumstances rather than forcing choice between career advancement and family stability. Alina made her decision with the clarity that had defined her emergency handling. Sir, I accept the assignment, pending confirmation that my parents are willing to relocate to Nevada. If they're not, I'll need to reconsider. Martin smiled, the expression carrying relief. Understood. ACC wants your acceptance before cutting orders, but they need confirmation soon. Talk to your parents, then let me know within a week. Alina left the office carrying weight of decision that would reshape her family's next 2 years. The assignment was professionally perfect, exactly the opportunity that could define her career trajectory. But it required asking her parents to uproot their lives again, to follow her to Nevada, to continue providing childcare while she taught at weapons school. The conversation with her parents happened via video call that evening, Alina laying out the opportunity and the implications directly. Her father listened carefully, her mother taking notes, both processing information with characteristic military family pragmatism. When Alina finished explaining, her mother spoke first. So they want you to teach at weapons school. That's significant, honey. That's not normal for a captain. Alina nodded. It's not. The emergency created visibility, and ACC thinks my experience is valuable for training development. But it means relocating to Nevada, and I can't do that without you. I won't ask you to uproot your lives again after you've already sacrificed 6 months watching the kids during this deployment. Her father exchanged glances with her mother, the silent communication of long marriage making words unnecessary. Then he spoke with typical directness. We'll move to Nevada. The kids need stability, you need family support, and this assignment is too important for your career to decline. We'll make it work. Relief and gratitude hit Alina simultaneously, emotion she'd been suppressing throughout the decision process. Are you sure? I know this isn't easy asking you to move again. Her mother smiled, the expression carrying maternal certainty. Alina, we're military family. We understand the requirements. Your father and I can relocate easily. The kids are young enough that school transition won't be traumatic, and Nevada has better weather than Virginia anyway. Tell the Air Force you accept. We'll handle the logistics. The call ended with plans forming, discussions about housing and schools and moving timelines. Alina felt something settle in her chest, the confirmation that she wasn't alone in managing single parenthood and career demands, that her family understood and supported her choices even when they required sacrifice. 2 weeks later, Alina boarded a transport aircraft for the flight home. 6 months in Afghanistan concluded, deployment complete. The squadron traveled together, pilots and maintainers and support personnel who'd shared the deployment experience, who'd flown missions and handled emergencies and built relationships forged in operational stress. Major Reyes sat beside her during the long flight, both of them too experienced to feel excitement about going home, both understanding the adjustment challenges that waited. You nervous about the Nellie's assignment? He asked, the question carrying understanding of career implications. Alina considered honestly. Some. Teaching at weapons school means instructing pilots more experienced than me. That's intimidating, but the curriculum development is important work and someone needs to do it. Might as well be someone who actually survived the emergency we're teaching about. Ray's nodded approval. That's the right perspective. The weapons school doesn't want perfect pilots. They want pilots who have learned from real experience and can teach those lessons. You qualify absolutely. The transport landed at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, the squadron processing through reception facilities before dispersing to home stations and leave. Alina's parents met her at the passenger terminal, her kids barely containing excitement at seeing their mother after 6 months. The reunion was everything she'd imagined during deployment. Hugs and tears and rapid-fire stories about everything the kids had experienced while she was gone. But underneath the joy, Alina felt the strain that deployment created, the months of separation that required rebuilding connection, the adjustment to being present parent rather than distant voice on video calls. The first weeks home were harder than combat flying, different kind of challenge requiring different skills. Her kids had adapted to her absence, developed routines that didn't include her, learned independence that came from necessity. Alina had to reinsert herself into their lives carefully, rebuilding trust and presence without disrupting the stability her parents had provided. It was exhausting, emotionally demanding in ways combat never was. But gradually, the family rhythm reestablished itself. Her daughter started including Alina in bedtime routines again. Her son stopped startling when she appeared in rooms unexpectedly. The wariness faded, replaced by comfort that came from consistent presence. And Alina learned again that parenting required patience she'd never needed in cockpit. The relocation to Nevada happened during summer, coordinated timing that allowed school transition at natural breakpoint. Alina's parents sold their Virginia house. She processed out of her previous duty station. The family moved across country to Las Vegas area, where Nellis Air Force Base dominated the landscape. The base housing was adequate. The schools were good. The weather was exactly as her mother predicted, hot and dry and utterly different from Virginia. Alina reported to the weapons school with mixture of anticipation and uncertainty, the 2-year assignment beginning with orientation that made clear the school's standards and expectations. The instructors were universally experienced, decorated pilots with combat records and tactical expertise that dwarfed her own. She was the most junior officer in the curriculum development office, the only captain in a room of majors and lieutenant colonels. But she was also the only pilot who'd survived extreme environmental emergency outside standard training parameters, which gave her authority that rank couldn't provide. The project lead for curriculum development was a lieutenant colonel named Sarah Morrison, an F-16 pilot with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for demanding excellence. She welcomed Alina with professional assessment that suggested judgment pending. Captain Vance, your emergency in Afghanistan created the requirement for this curriculum development. That gives you subject matter expertise, but curriculum development requires more than personal experience. You'll need to translate your survival into teachable procedures that work for pilots across platforms and situations. Can you do that? Alina met the question directly. Ma'am, I can do that. I've thought extensively about my emergency, what I did right, what could have been better, how the lessons apply broadly. I'm ready to contribute at whatever level you need. Morrison nodded, satisfied with the response. Good. You'll be working with a team of experienced instructors, designing scenarios, writing procedures, testing curriculum with student pilots. The work is detailed, sometimes frustrating, always important. Questions. Alina had one question that mattered more than technical details. Ma'am, will I be flying while assigned here, or is this purely ground assignment? Morrison smiled, the expression suggesting she'd expected this question from every pilot assigned to her office. You'll maintain currency, fly periodic sorties, possibly instruct if your skills warrant, but your primary duty is curriculum development. Flying is secondary for this assignment. If that's a problem, speak now. It wasn't a problem. Alina had flown combat missions for 6 months, led formations, survived emergencies. 2 years focusing on training development wouldn't diminish her flying skills. would actually enhance her understanding of aviation at systemic level. "No problem, ma'am. I'm here to contribute to the mission." The curriculum development work was intellectually demanding in ways flying never was, requiring analytical thinking and procedural writing and educational theory. Alina worked with team designing scenarios that would teach pilots to recognize environmental hazards, respond to extreme weather emergencies, make correct decisions when standard procedures didn't apply. They tested scenarios with student pilots, refined procedures based on feedback, iterated until the curriculum worked reliably. Her emergency became the basis for an entire training module, her decisions analyzed and formalized into decision trees that other pilots could follow. It was strange seeing her experience transformed into educational material, her survival becoming lesson plan. But it was also validating, confirmation that her handling of the emergency had been correct enough to teach. 6 months into the assignment, Alina stood in front of a weapons school class for the first time, teaching the extreme weather emergency module she'd helped develop. The students were experienced pilots, each one carefully selected for weapons school attendance, each one arguably more skilled than Alina. But for this topic, she had authority they didn't. She'd survived the emergency they were training to handle. Her lecture began with video from her emergency, cockpit footage showing frozen instruments and degraded controls, audio of her radio transmissions demonstrating her decision-making process. Then she walked through the emergency step by step, explaining her thinking, the factors she considered, why she made specific choices. The students listened with intensity that suggested genuine interest, taking notes, asking questions that indicated they understood the complexity. When she finished, one student raised his hand, a major with F-15 experience. "Captain, when you decided to commit to landing with questionable gear, what convinced you that was better than ejection? Because the manual says ejection is safer in that situation." Alina had anticipated this question, had asked it herself dozens of times during curriculum development. The manual is right for most situations. Ejection is almost always safer than landing with known gear problems. But my situation had specific factors that changed the calculation. I was overpopulated airfield. Ejection would have resulted in uncontrolled aircraft impacting near base housing. I had fuel for only one more approach, so delaying the decision just used resources without improving options. And most importantly, my gut told me the gear was extended even though I couldn't confirm locked position. I trusted my experience, my assessment of the situation, over what the manual recommended. Classroom was silent, absorbing this explanation. Then another student, a Navy pilot on exchange assignment, asked follow-up. "So you're teaching us to trust gut instinct over procedures? That seems like dangerous lesson for weapons school." Alina smiled, having expected this reaction too. "I'm teaching you that procedures guide decisions, but they don't make decisions. You make decisions, using procedures as framework, considering specific circumstances, accepting responsibility for outcomes." In my case, the manual said eject, but the specific situation said land. I made the choice, accepted the risk, took responsibility. That's combat aviation. That's what we do. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, sitting in the back of the classroom observing the instruction, nodded approval. After class, she approached Alina with feedback that carried weight. "That was excellent instruction. You walked the line between teaching procedures and acknowledging that real situations require judgment. It's hard to teach, but you did it naturally." Alina appreciated the feedback, the confirmation that her transition from flying to instruction was succeeding. "Thank you, ma'am. I was nervous about teaching more experienced pilots, but they seemed engaged." Morrison's expression turned more serious. "They were engaged because you're credible. You survived what you're teaching, you speak from experience, you acknowledge complexity. That's what makes good instructors. You have potential here beyond this 2-year assignment." The comment hung in the air, suggesting possibilities Alina hadn't considered. Remaining at weapons school, transitioning from temporary curriculum development to permanent instructor role, building career around training rather than operational flying. It was attractive in some ways, stability for her family, important work, respect from best pilots in Air Force. But it also meant stepping away from cockpit permanently, becoming instructor rather than operator. The choice wasn't immediate, didn't require decision now. But Morrison's comment made clear that options existed, that Alina's career could develop in directions she hadn't anticipated. That evening, at home with her kids and parents, Alina reflected on how far her trajectory had shifted. 2 years ago, she'd been junior captain fighting for respect in squadron that questioned single mothers' combat effectiveness. 1 year ago, she'd been deployed to Afghanistan, flying combat missions while managing guilt about absent parenting. 6 months ago, she'd survived emergency that should have killed her, proven competence through survival, earned recognition that opened career doors. Now she was teaching at weapons school, developing curriculum that would train Air Force's best pilots, considering whether her future was instruction rather than operations. And somehow, improbably, it all felt right. Her kids were thriving in Nevada schools, her parents were happy in better climate, her family was stable for first time in years. The weapons schoolwork was challenging and meaningful, contributing to mission without deploying, teaching without leaving her kids for months. The balance she'd struggled to achieve felt suddenly achievable, the competing demands of career and family finding equilibrium. As her daughter practiced piano in the living room, as her son built block towers that collapsed dramatically, as her parents prepared dinner with comfortable routine, Alina understood that survival wasn't just about emergencies. It was about building life that worked, making choices that served multiple priorities, accepting that perfection was impossible but good enough was attainable. The 2-year assignment stretched ahead, time to develop curriculum, teach students, prove capability beyond cockpit. And at the end, she'd have choices. Return to operational flying, remain at weapons school, pursue leadership roles that leveraged her training development experience. The path wasn't predetermined, wasn't limited by other people's assumptions about single mothers or combat effectiveness. She'd proven what needed proving, earned respect that created opportunities, demonstrated that competence mattered more than family circumstances. The emergency that nearly killed her had become the catalyst that transformed her career. The frozen hydraulics, the questionable gear, the impossible landing, all of it had mattered beyond the immediate survival. It had shown who she was under ultimate pressure, what she valued when forced to choose, how she performed when manual procedures offered no guidance. And the answer, documented in cockpit video and radio transmissions and after-action reports, was that she performed exceptionally. Not because she was fearless or superhuman, because she was competent, trained, willing to make hard decisions and accept consequences. That was enough. That would always be enough. In the quiet evening of her Nevada home, thousands of miles from Afghan valleys and combat operations, Alina understood that she'd found what many pilots never did. Purpose beyond flying, identity beyond call sign, life that worked across all dimensions rather than excelling in one while failing in others. The A-10 had brought her home through frozen skis and impossible conditions. But the real journey had been internal, the path from proving herself to accepting herself, from seeking validation to providing it for next generation. And that journey, unlike any deployment, was just beginning.